So here in the Department of Public Administration, we have a series of program level competencies and student learning outcomes that we want to ensure that all of our students acquire. We have broader ambitions in terms of what we want you to leave this program understanding, hopefully mastering. And as it relates to this video very specifically links to program level competency number 1, that each MPA graduate will be competent to lead and manage a public, nonprofit, or public affairs governance. So that's pretty broad, right? So what exactly does that mean? Well, we tie it specifically, as you see on the screen, to Student Learning Outcome 1.2, apply theories that can inform leadership and management within organizations. And that's what we're going to be talking about during this video, is how theory is something you can leverage and perhaps already are leveraging within your professional life. For me, I had a background before I went into an MPA program where I was very interested in some of the books that are up here. Really some of this Camus work was very important to me, and I think I entered into the program, my MPA program, not necessarily seeing how the two could be connected. So I had this very direct interest, maybe robust interest in theory and some continental philosophy, and I didn't necessarily see it being connected to public administration. And through my MPA program, I began to have that teased out a little. A few faculty members who saw the role of literature and philosophy and theory in the classroom. But it was really when I entered into my doctoral program that I began to get immediate exposure to the fact that an interest in philosophy, an interest in theory, didn't have to be something that one had to the side or held in abeyance within the discipline, but something that could have a very meaningful role in the classroom, in one's research, and ultimately one's identity and orientation to the discipline. What did you experience, and how have you experienced it in your career?
I think I was very fortunate in that when I went to graduate school at Syracuse's Maxwell School, it was shortly after the Middlebrook Conference and the founding of what we now refer to as the second movement of New Public Administration. So I studied with Dwight Waldo, Orion White, George Fredrickson, Larry Kirkcard, Frank Marini, some of whose books you can see in front of you there. And what was so interesting about that is it really reflected a time of much social upheaval and political change. This is around the time of Watergate, and I finished my doctorate after Watergate. So there was a great deal of concern about ethics in government, about being able to form public organizations that were very adaptive to change, also organizations that were non-hierarchical, I guess I can say. And so this really pushed me to try to talk about theory in a different way. That plus the fact that Orion White and Larry Kirkcard were very keen on theory and practice, and reflective practitioners being the model that we wanted to uphold in public administration theory. So that's really what forged, I think, my identity, my interest in public administration, and in particular public organizations.
And you talked about how you benefited from having those individuals who really impressed upon you the importance of this dialogic relationship between theory and practice, right? And I think that's something kind of as we begin to think about how our relationship with PA theory has maybe changed or progressed or evolved over time. That's something for me, especially in the classroom, I've come to have a deeper appreciation for, and I see more. I think early in my career, certainly in the latter stages of being a doctoral student, they were still kind of separate, right? They were kind of practice matters, theory matters, and I didn't see the way they could begin to connect with one another. But I think as you enter into the classroom, and there's an obligation in a master's program to begin to let oneself be present, right? And kind of bring your whole self into the classroom, including your interest in things. It's really helped me begin to see that the necessity of having that dialogue between theory and practice, maybe even approaching something like praxis that I know we may talk about a little later. How has it changed for you over time, your relationship to theory?
One of the things that has changed is that in terms of the the way we talk about public administration theory, that we have something that's more grounded in the field of public administration rather than drawing from disparate strands of sociology, political science, economics, and so forth. So it's much more in tune with the actual practice in the agencies or in governance of multiple agencies than it was before. So it is much more focused, it's much narrower in terms of its emphasis. I should say that when I talk about theory, generally with incoming students, that many of them think, well, theory, that's kind of like statistics or math, I have a natural aversion to it. I feel, that it's not something that I can do. But what really becomes apparent pretty quickly is that people already are doing theory. They just don't realize that. I'm sure we're going to get into that later. But what I do try to emphasize in the classroom is that there's nothing more practical than a good theory. The idea is to be able to articulate it.
So one of the things that I think can begin to inhibit theory being present in the classroom is the fact that that word theory can be so big for certain people, right? It can drift all the way over to navel gazing, or it can sometimes begin this very obtuse, indirect approach to sharing knowledge or generating knowledge. And in a field that's so wonderfully practical, right? I mean, in the end, public administration is a field of practice. Theory can begin to be intimidating for some students, or as you alluded to earlier, right, it can be this thing that you just, before you even really know what it is, you have an aversion to it for some reason. So I think it's incumbent upon us, and that's kind of the part of this video in some way, to begin to show students that theory is something that has value and it isn't something that's so big in the world. So maybe you can talk about that a little, the value of demystifying theory.
Well, one of the things that becomes quite apparent when you start talking to people who practice public administration is that they all have a theory. Even if they're not aware of it or they don't recognize it, it may be thin, it may be sketchy, it may be in pieces, but it stems from what they do. It stems from what they do and a blending of their worldview about human nature and how that figures into supervision and management and leadership. But people, all human beings, have a motive, have a drive to generalize on their lived experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where I see the value of theory in a PA, especially a Master's in Public Administration program, right? Is if you don't begin to show that we are all employing theories all the time, then it makes individuals very vulnerable to theoretical oppression would be too heavy-handed a word or description.
No, I like it.
But you begin to exist in a space where when someone says, I have a theory about X, right, you're like, oh, wow, it takes on this metaphysical status, right, this mythical status. Mm-hmm. But if people, especially practitioners, can begin to see that they're employing theories all the time, right, then it makes them less beholden or less vulnerable to someone who comes to kind of declare from on high a theory for everyone to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we talk about public organizations and how they work the way they do and why, I often enjoy people's responses to scientific management and Frederick Taylor. It's really wonderful to see that people say, well, we're doing those things. I'm actually doing that in my work. That's why my work is organized the way it is. That's why the routine is structured the way it is. But I never really understood that it came from someplace and that there's a writing to go to that informs it.
So theory has this way both within the organization and then as a lens outside of the organization to really begin to analyze what are these rules of the world, what are these rules of practice, right? That they aren't just naturally occurring, that someone created them at some point. Right? And that gives us power, right? As practitioners, as students, as scholars, that gives us a certain kind of power that I think only arrives through the use of theory.
Yes, what it helps you with is to understand how earlier iterations of perhaps a trend that is happening in government at the moment, some kind of a reform effort, how something like it occurred in the past and that there were drawbacks with it as well as positives with it. So a book like Ties of Reform would be an example of that. A lot of people who read that say, oh, I didn't understand that there was a concern earlier in our history about downsizing in government. But now I understand what happened and why, and you can begin to anticipate what may happen in this wave of reform.
Certainly, and it's that very practical usage that becomes so important in our discipline, right? Because as you offered up earlier, at its base, we're all using theories every day. Maybe, and to a degree, we're all creating theories on some intermittent status, right? Essentially, when you encounter two things in the world and try to weave a relationship between those two, that at its most basic level is a theory, right? Albeit a very thin theory. But if you can begin to see your role as a human, specifically for these purposes, as a practitioner in theory making, in theory usage, in theory challenging, right? Then I think we end up in a place where we can see the value of theory not just as something that occurs in the classroom or we're forced to do in the classroom or encounter, but something that we're employing in our everyday lives. So our discussion of the role of theory within practice, the role of theory within public administration, this is by no means something that you and I are coming up with, right? This is something that there's a strong tradition of scholars who have developed this in our field and elsewhere. And the word that really encapsulates is this notion of praxis, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about what praxis means to you and what you see as its value.
I think of praxis as a blending of theory and practice and how each half of that informs the other. So this is an evolving, growing compilation of wisdom about what people do in government, in nonprofits. So what that means to me is that you're constantly checking how you're thinking about what you do, and also changing what you do based on perhaps new insights, new perspectives, new outlooks on what you do.
Yes, and I think that right there, that's that value of praxis, right? And it's a word that can be thrown around sometimes, and you just say theory and practice have a relationship to one another, but it really is that dialogue that's so important, right? And many scholars use different terms for kind of that dialogic relationship between the two, but it's sometimes the only way you make sense of a weird encounter, an unexpected encounter in the workplace, right? Or some unexpected encounters elsewhere in one's life. And theories, that's the value of them in so many ways, right? I mean, as practitioners, we ultimately need to be thinking of ways that we can ensure productive public agencies, right, or nonprofit organizations. And the encounters with the unexpected, encounters with the uncommon are going to occur. And one of the ways we can begin to mitigate the negative effects of these encounters or begin to adapt and adjust is through the use of theories, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I absolutely love it when people in the classroom start to talk about their experiences, trying to manage perhaps some crisis events or special situations, because they begin to understand how they use their personal outlooks to inform what they do, and how there are other alternative ways of looking at events and the field of practice. So I really enjoy that. In looking at my concern about how to bring people to understanding praxis and how theory informs what they do, I think being reflective about these kinds of situations, these kinds of events is really critical. And that to me means that we're not in public administration trying to build theory for its own sake or to salve some deep-seated anxiety that workers have about their workplace, but it's all about trying to improve the administrative wisdom that individuals have and how to contribute to better public work.
Yes. And the point you made there, amongst many really good points, that idea of in kind of bringing your whole self to the table, right? I mean, we're all, I talked earlier about kind of the role of literature. We have an assemblage of books out here where scholars within different disciplines, and as you said earlier, right, one of the powerful moments, and certainly how PA theory has changed in the last few decades, is we're now no longer so reliant on theories from other studies, right? We have our own body of theories and an emerging and growing body of PA-specific theories.
Right.
But that idea of being able to go elsewhere, right? I mean, we're reading literature, we're seeing films, we're watching TV shows, we're having encounters in kind of religious spaces in our lives and otherwise. And the point where we no longer leave those all subdivided, but we begin to kind of look within and kind of this existential exercise of what is the connective tissue between these different experiences, right?
Right.
How do I invite my worldview into the workplace and let that inform how I analyze, an uncertain event, how I allow that to inform my approach to my job, right? On some basic level, that is theory right there. That's employing one's own theoretical orientation to the universe to guide their practice, right?
Absolutely.
So as we bring this to a close, who are some theorists? What are some texts in the field? I know we have a selection out here. Maybe you can talk about some of those, or otherwise that if a student's really interested in theory that they should check out, or some that have really excited you over the years.
Well, of course, I have to talk about my mentors at Syracuse. I would talk about Frank Marini's toward a New Public Administration, which is a compendium of the papers that were presented at the conference near Syracuse, New York. I also would talk about George Fredrickson's The Spirit of Public Administration, which I don't have here. But I also would stress that the whole idea of praxis and the reflective practitioner really comes from Chris Argyris's work and also Donald Schoen's work. This particular book, Frame Reflection, is one of those examples. I also have an earlier book of Argyris and Schoen's on theory and practice. These books really help me to understand how the way individuals think about an organization and think about their place in it really helps to ground your understanding in why the organization is the way it is. So it's how it places you in a particular culture and in a particular mindset. So the fact that they talk about this in a way that anyone can understand, I think is really important. I have to also mention Dwight Waldo's, to me, more significant book, and that is Public Administration in a Time of Turbulence. I think it's a good book because when he wrote it, it was a time of turbulence, and now you can consider that this may be a time of turbulence again. So it may apply all over again in new ways. I think it gives you true insight into organization change and systemic change. Those insights are very powerful at any time.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting mix when we talk about, right, it can be this, it can be a specific theorist who draws you in, right? I think for practitioners it's so important to potentially, and then they probably do sometimes without even knowing it, having a dialogue with a theorist or a scholar who they find important or has a certain degree of resonance, right, with the way you see the world, right? This is the power of some of Chris Ansell's work. And but I think for me, some books that have really stood out over the years, other than kind of some of the work of Camus that certainly runs aside, I should say, is finding kind of an orientation to encounters with the world that give us guidance. So if you find one of those, picking up a reader such as this phenomenology reader can be very beneficial to walk you through that environment. I think David John Farmer's To Kill the King, very similar to Dwight Waller's Public Administration in a Time of Turbulence, a book that was inspired in the wake of 9/11, and it is really him processing that and what that means for the discipline, what it means for practitioners, is a really important book work. And then you talked earlier about those books we can look back on in the past that give us some insight into today, and I think Cam Stiver's Bureau Men Settlement Women is a book that really I return to over and over again because the way we talked earlier a little bit about conventions and how conventions are challenged or break over time, and theories become a way to question, well, should we have ever had that convention? How did we end up with that convention? And I think her work helps us see some of the elements of it that maybe we take for granted as it relates to gender and even race.
I see you've also brought one of the books that really helped forge some of my worldview at Syracuse, and that is Berger and Luckman's The Social Construction of Reality. This book came out in 1967. This is a later edition. Mine is all dog-eared and worn and underlined all over the place, but it is seminal, at least for me, because it breaks open the whole idea of organizations being seen as static, objective entities that are very concrete and very depersonalized. They may appear as depersonalized, but organization life is really created by the people embedded within it, and they create it and recreate it all the time. So it's important to understand for leadership that individuals change organizations through their leadership.
What we know about the sedimented nature of knowledge, right, is there's people who have built entire careers on third iterations of theories, right, both in practice and in scholarship. So the value of sometimes, you don't have to read the whole thing, right? It's sometimes easy for theorists to kind of, again, come from this position of on high and this off-putting sense of superiority at times. But sometimes just going back and getting an appreciation for that original context, right? As we talk about Waldo's, we talk about David John Farmer, and knowing kind of what inspired this theory to come about in that earliest moment, right? So, I think we've offered up a few resources here in terms of books we're interested in, some approaches to literature. If you're really interested in theory, I think there's the dominant area in public administration, certainly the PA Theory Network that we've both been active in throughout our careers, and then administrative theory and praxis is really the central repository of thin, thick, medium thickness PA theory and the discipline. I think a resource that's really important that sometimes students can take for granted is if you find yourself in a position where you're really engaged with theory and it really grabs you, right? And sometimes maybe it takes you back to that philosophy class you had in undergrad or maybe literature you're exposed to. Then coming to talk to us, right? I mean, coming and talking to faculty members who are interested in theory, who are passionate about theory, sometimes even reaching out to scholars at other universities, right? That can be so valuable. Sometimes we drift into a space, right, where as theorists, as PA theorists, where we find or create this contentious or antagonistic relationship with people who are more empirically oriented or more sometimes want to create this practice theory divide, right? And theory isn't meant for practice. But, and maybe sometimes some of those people have fair complaints and criticisms. But I think one of the central values of PA theory that really differentiates it from a lot of other areas is it not only invites and enables, but I think it compels. If you're really into PA theory, then it allows, it compels you to say, where are we going as a field, right? Why are we doing all of this, right? And that's a question that originates and is nurtured and is supported in PA theory in a way that it isn't in other subdivisions. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that unlike other professional degree programs, other professional fields, public administration is concerned about always posing the question at the ultimate level, which is, what is the public interest in all of this? Why am I doing this? Why is this organization doing this? What purpose does it serve? What value does it have? And I think that outward perspective towards the understanding that what you're in this for is always making sure that you're trying to contribute to a better society. That's what's important about public administration. This is not to say that social work or business doesn't have some, external identification with macro issues. But in public administration, it is towards making a better society. That's what we're about.
If you look at, we have Richard Fox up here, we have Miller and Fox, we have certainly Cam Stivers, Waldo, others, David John Farmer, what unifies their approach to the field, kind of if you look for that melody line in their work, it's a desire to make a change in the universe, right? To make a change in society. And I think, not all subdivisions of public administration, certainly not all professional degrees, have the luxury of exploring normative issues, right? Kind of what ought to be as opposed to what is, right? So, yeah, I think the point you make is so important, and that is where some of that PA, some of the most powerful transformative work in public administration has been from those who would self-identify as theorists and proudly drape, the PA theory title over their shoulders, and dream of what can be, while also responsibly examining what is and what has been. Right? So I think that brings us to a close really for this video. The whole purpose of this is to kind of get those juices boiling in students' heads before they get to class. But thank you for choosing this program, and I hope you have a great discussion in class about theory and begin to think about what's your orientation to theory, and to not be afraid of it, right? It doesn't have to be this big thing. It's something we use all the time, and it's something that has been, and will continue to be wildly beneficial, not only to our discipline, but to all of society, and specifically to those who are engaged in public service. Thank you.
Remember this. Yes, thank you. And remember, there's nothing more practical than a good theory.